Reality Transurfing, Book 1, The Space of Variations, Chapter 2, Pendulums. Pendulums. Rent yourself out. Destructive pendulums. We are taught from childhood to obey the will of others, to perform our duties, serve our country, our family, the company we work for, a political party, the state, or even an idea, to serve anyone except ourselves. To varying degrees, everyone has a sense of duty, responsibility, necessity, and guilt. Everyone is ready to serve a group or organization in one way or another, be it family, a club, school, company, political party, the state, and so on. All these structures emerge and develop when a separate group of people begin to think and act in the same way. Then they are joined by others and the structure grows, gaining strength, forcing its members to follow the rules, and eventually amassing the potential to gain control over large groups of society. On the material level, the structure consists of a group of people united by common goals and material objects such as buildings, furniture, equipment, machinery, technology, and so on. On an energetic level, however, a structure appears when a group of people think in the same way, as a result of which the parameters of their thought energy are identical. Their thought energy finally unites into a single current. When this happens, as if in the middle of an entire ocean of energy, a separate, independent energy information structure is created, which is referred to as an energy pendulum. Eventually, this structure begins to live its own life and subjugate to its laws the very people who created it. The structure is referred to as a pendulum because the more people, adherents, that feed it with their energy, the more powerfully it sways. Every pendulum has its own characteristic beat frequency. For example, if you want to get a swing moving, you have to push it to a certain rhythm or frequency. This is called the resonant frequency. If the number of adherents decreases, the force of its swing is weakened. If it loses all its adherents, the pendulum will stop moving completely and thereby cease to exist as a separate identity. Examples of defunct pendulums are ancient pagan religions, stone tools, ancient weapons, outdated trends of fashion, and vinyl records. In other words, all that once existed but now no longer functions. You might be surprised that all the things in this list qualify as pendulums. Any structure whose particular features were created by collective thought energy represents a pendulum. Generally speaking, all living beings capable of radiating energy at a particular vibration will sooner or later form an energy pendulum. Examples of pendulums in nature are bacterial colonies, populations of living creatures, schools of fish, herds of animals, forests, prairies, anthills, etc. Essentially, any organized, homogeneous structure made up of living organisms can be a pendulum. Every living organism represents a single unit of energy, and so can also be considered an elementary pendulum. When a group of individual pendulums begins to sway in unison, a group pendulum is created which looms over its followers like a superstructure. The group pendulum exists as an independent entity and sets rules for its adherents to follow, partly to keep them together, but also to attract new ones. This type of entity is independent in the sense that it develops according to its own laws. Its adherents are unaware of the fact that they are acting in accordance with the laws of the pendulum and not their own will. For example, a bureaucratic apparatus develops as an independent structure irrespective of the will of its individual officials. Of course, an influential official is free to make their own decisions, but only to the extent that they do not contradict the laws of the system. Otherwise, that particular adherent will be rejected. Even people who represent individual pendulums are not always aware of their true motivations. Energy vampires being one such example. Any pendulum is by its nature inherently destructive because it consumes the energy of its adherents and establishes power over them. The pendulum's destructive quality is clearly demonstrated by the fact that it attributes no meaning to the fate of the individual adherent. The purpose of the pendulum is only to get energy from its adherents, whether it is to their personal benefit or not. When a person comes under the influence of a system, they are forced to build their lives in accordance with its laws. Otherwise, the system will chew them up and spit them out. Once under the influence of a destructive pendulum, you can easily end up ruining your entire life, and as a rule, it is difficult to break free without suffering losses. If a person is lucky, they find their place within the system and feel at home there. The adherent gives their energy to the pendulum, which in return provides the individual with an environment. If a follower rebels against the laws of the structure, the frequency of their thought energy ceases to be in harmony with the resonance frequency of the pendulum. Being deprived of essential energy, the pendulum either drives the maverick adherent out of the system or destroys them. If, however, a person has ended up a long way from a lifeline favorable to their growth, life inside the structure of an alien pendulum can be as soulless as hard labor or just turn into a very sad existence. In this case, the pendulum is purely destructive to its adherent. Whether they like it or not, a person who falls under a pendulum's influence loses their freedom, being forced to live by imposed laws and becoming a small cog in a big machine. That said, an individual can find themselves under the protectorship of a pendulum and achieve outstanding results. Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin, and other similar figures were all favorites of destructive pendulums. This does not mean that the pendulum was actually concerned for their personal well-being, for it exploited them to its own end. When Napoleon was asked whether he had ever been truly happy, he could count just a few days over his entire life. The pendulum uses sophisticated methods to lure new adherents who fly to it like moths to a flame. How often people are deceived by the pendulum's advertising tricks and move far away from a potential happiness that was so close. Young men leave for the army and lose their lives. Students go to the university learning in vain to master a profession that is not really for them. They find work that feels alien, but it is supposedly prestigious, and end up drowning in a swamp of problems, or they join their lives with a stranger only to regret it later. The pendulum can hide its motives behind various well-meaning masks, and yet its activities can ruin the lives of its adherents. The greatest threat the pendulum poses to the individual is that it leads its victims away from other lifelines where they would be able to find happiness. These are the characteristic features of a destructive pendulum. A pendulum feeds on the energy of its adherents, which increases the power of its sway. A pendulum strives to attract as many followers as possible to source as much energy as possible. A pendulum makes a contradistinction between its group of adherents and all other groups. We are good and they are bad. We are better than they are, etc. A pendulum acts aggressively towards anyone who refuses to follow it, attempting to win them over, neutralize their position, or get rid of them. A pendulum hides behind masks and lofty ideas. It plays on people's feelings to justify its actions and attracts as many adherents as possible. Essentially, the pendulum is an egregore, and yet the concept of egregore does not fully reflect the entire range of possible interactions between an individual and an energy-based information structure. Pendulums play a much greater role in people's lives than one might like to think. The following example illustrates how a pendulum consumes the energy of its adherents. Imagine a packed stadium at an intense football match. Passions are running high and the fans are raging with excitement. One player makes an unforgivable mistake which results in his team losing the game. The fans in the crowd focus a storm of anger at the culprit player, ready to tear him to pieces. Imagine what a huge mass of negative energy is focused on the unfortunate player. You would think that from such an attack of negative emotion the player would die on the spot, but he remains alive and well, if not a little crushed by feelings of guilt. This is because the negative energy directed towards the player is absorbed by the pendulum. If this were not the case, then any individual becoming the object of a crowd's hate would lose their life, and any idol would simply float above the ground. I am no judge of whether a pendulum is an animate entity or simply an energy form. Either way, the distinction does not affect the transurfing method. The most important thing is to be able to recognize a pendulum and avoid being drawn into a game unless you stand to benefit from the interaction. There is one identifying factor by which a destructive pendulum can always be recognized. It always competes with others similar to it in the battle for adherence. The pendulum has one goal, which is to attract as many supporters as possible to source as much energy as possible. The more aggressive a pendulum behaves in the battle for devotees, the more destructive it is, i.e., the more dangerous it is to the life of the individual. Some may object that charitable organizations exist for the protection of the environment and animals, etc., and question why this type of group should be considered destructive. These groups are destructive to the individual because, whichever way you look at it, they still feed on a person's energy with no concern for that individual's happiness or well-being. Organizations like these call for compassion to others and yet remain indifferent to their own followers. If a person feels comfortable and genuinely happy working for such an organization, then they have probably found their vocation, and consequently the pendulum is the place for them. However, it is also important to be honest with yourself and ask yourself whether you are not perhaps wearing the mask of the benefactor. Are you donating your energy and money for the good of others with true sincerity, or is being involved in charity just an attempt to feel a better person or look good? Destructive pendulums have trained people out of choosing their own destiny because if individuals retain enough independence to have the freedom to choose, it will be much harder for the pendulum to attract so many followers. Our mind is so used to the idea that our fate is our lot in life that we find it really difficult to believe that we can simply choose a destiny that is more to our liking. It is advantageous for pendulums to keep their adherents under control, so they invent all sorts of ways of manipulating them. The following examples show how this is done. Transurfing could also become a pendulum if someone turned it into a pseudo-religion, movement, or school. Different pendulums are, of course, destructive to varying degrees. At worst, transurfing would be minimally destructive because it focused exclusively on the well-being of the individual rather than a shared goal. Transurfing would be a very unusual pendulum with a community of individuals concerned solely with their own destiny. If you were to do some homework, what other types of pendulum would you consider constructive? I'm telling you all this in order to describe what it really means to choose your fate. So have patience, dear reader. Not all these ideas are easy to grasp, but as we go on, a clearer picture will emerge. End segment.